Hello, everyone. Hi. No worries. We promise you a very interesting discussion, so please do stick around. I wanted to thank you for choosing this session. I know it's been a very packed day, and I'm very grateful you're all here. We have a wonderful set of panelists, and we're going to have a very interesting discussion. So thank you very much for being here. This is a session looking beyond the EU data strategy and thinking where next for data use and regulation. My name is Valentina Pavel, and I'm a senior researcher at the Ada Lovelace Institute. We are an independent research institute with a mission to ensure that data and AI work for people and society. And for us, this means that the benefits, opportunities, and privileges from generated by data and AI are justly and equitably distributed and experienced. Last year, we published a report called Rethinking Data and Rebalancing Digital Power. And that work started from a question looking at what would a more ambitious vision for data use and regulation look like. A vision that would tackle asymmetries of power, that would promote individual and collective rights, that would promote more responsible uses of data. And much of that work focused on questions of power. This panel will also reflect on those questions. And we were guided by our expert working group, and we went through a process of deliberation that mapped 4 areas for transformative change across infrastructure, institutions, governance, and public participation in data and decisions about data. And today's discussion is going to build on that work and reflect on some of the fundamental questions that are left unaddressed by the new EU digital package of regulation and explore new opportunities that would prepare the ground for more ambitious transformations in data-driven systems. And to help us navigate these issues, we have Adriana Nugter, a senior independent consultant with more than 20 years experience in the wireless communication sector and expertise across data, artificial intelligence, ethical certification and standardization. Next, we have Katarzyna Szymielewicz, a human rights and technology lawyer and president of the Panoptykon Foundation. Kasia heavily contributed to our Rethinking Data report, and she was a member of our Rethinking Data working group. Next, we have Inge Graef, Associate Professor of Competition Law at Tilburg University, working at the intersection between competition law, platform regulation, and the governance of data-driven innovation. And next, we have Theresa Stadler, a research assistant at École Polytechnique Fédérale de Lausanne in Switzerland, focusing on the privacy implications of large-scale data processing. Theresa also contributed to our Rethinking Data report. In terms of the format for this session, I'm going to shortly invite Adriana to set the stage with a brief keynote. And I am sure for the like-minded privacy enthusiasts in the room that you will be equally excited to hear her speak. Adriana is the author of a landmark comparative study of the early wave of data protection law in Europe. And I'm really grateful and honored that she accepted our invitation, and she's going to share her reflections with us today. And with the GDPR 5th anniversary tomorrow, I'm sure you heard this all throughout today, and the AI Act going into trialogue stage, and the DSA, the DMA, and the DGA, lots of acronyms. Digital Markets Act, Digital Services Act, Digital Governance Act going into implementation stage. It feels like today is a good moment to reflect both on the histories as well as the futures of data protection. So without further ado, I would invite Adriana to warm up the discussion. And invite her to take us on a journey from the early starts of data protection law and how some of the societal concerns around automation can have similarities to what we're experiencing today with the fast pace of AI development, point out a few stress tests for data protection law, and look beyond or on what would new mechanisms that would achieve this more ambitious transformation look like. So thank you very much. And Adriana, you have the floor.
Thank you, Valentina, and thank you so much for the invitation to speak at this conference. And I think actually the timing of your report on rethinking data and rebalancing digital power is excellent, especially with the launch, so to say, or all the discussions we have nowadays on generative AI, because that really requires a rethinking power, rethinking regulation. How will we deal with this? So fortunately and unfortunately, I have a long history with data privacy. I started a PhD on the issue in 1985, and which resulted in that book, which was focusing actually not on the big brother, but on the private sector. What was the private sector going to do when they were going to automate, and what were our rights? At the time, obviously, there was still not a GDPR. I'm actually checking if I have something to change my slides, but let me first, is there, no, it's not yet, but then I'll do like this then when you, I want you to, or maybe you can get me one at some point. Oh, thank you. So after this PhD, I worked a lot with the introduction of the GSM standard, where obviously you have transborder flow of personal data. From a business perspective, you have call detail records, personal data, potentially, in any case, data going across borders. So at the time, and I think this is also an important lesson for today, we worked with the technical people, the standardization people, to see how we could implement the GSM standard in such a way that it would not compromise data privacy. And Mr. Schrems wasn't around at the time, but I'm sure he would have been proud of us taking that into account without a mandatory GDPR available, but only national roaming laws and national data protection laws. I would summarize, or would like to summarize, the start of data protection as this, as a baseline, no secret systems and no secret decisions. That was very much influenced by the Second World War, by obviously Aldous Huxley and his famous book 1984. The idea was the key normative framework, which was a clear no to Big Brother watching you. And what was essential in those data privacy legislations was, and this thinking was both on the US and in Europe, that we should counter informational asymmetry through transparency. Transparency and then give individuals rights so that they would know about the data, they could correct them, they could access them, they would know the purpose for which they were collected. The legislation was supposed to empower the individual so that they could self-determine how their privacy was being dealt with. And therefore, you see here on the slide, you see informational asymmetry helped by the key enabler transparency, which then can lead to a truly informed consent. And this was possible in that environment because the technological environment was about automation. We hardly use that term anymore. Automation is very passive. It's very passive, and it was used in the private sector more for operational purposes than anything else. Of course, there was some direct marketing, and there was a discussion about sensitive data also used in the private sector. But the concern was with the public sector. But again, this was the three elements the legislation was built around. And in fact, you could say that the informed consent went well with also with the the spirit of the time, that as an individual, you are like a homo economicus, taking your own decisions. You are self-managing the use of your data. Today, in fact, we still have that framework with some additional elements like human in the loop and class actions. But the key, in my accent, is still the same. However, what did not stay the same? Of course, the technology. And a key moment in time was, and a key enabler was when we changed from Web 1.0 to Web 2.0. Because that changed the whole internet from a read-only thing to an interactive thing, where suddenly location data were to be found, where there was interaction, where not only I as a user could post whatever else on the internet, but also because the devices from a technological perspective were communicating, data could be picked up from my side and could be used by the private sector. In the beginning, none of this happened. People didn't think about what to do. These days, there were useless data, but slowly it was felt that this was, new gold and could be exploited. So, this change from Web to Web 2.0, happening around 2005, I would say, has been a key enabler to the world where we are in today. Obviously, the mobile internet, IoT, algorithms, AI, of course, further facilitated and created more fertile grounds to end up where we are today. The business models, therefore, were able to change. They could change from just data serving automation to data as raw material for profit and control. So the business models completely changed. There was also and is a push for digitization. All this happens, from 2005 up to now. A push for digitization, hunger for more and more data. Because, and we shouldn't underestimate the psychological aspect of this, but more and more data gives you the idea that maybe you can predict what will happen, and nobody likes uncertainty. So this push is fed by both businesses, but also, of course, by governments who like to see and predict what's going to happen next. Also, a push for control. A push for control through because of a control replacing trust. Before, you would have to trust people and companies. Now you can control them. This has again a very negative impact, because if governments, like in the previous session, I'm not sure if you were there, were talking about how in the Netherlands they made a huge mistake with data held by the tax authorities to use to identify fraud. The moment you start to control your citizens, you no longer trust them, you create a huge gap between you and the people you are working with. So the push for control, made possible by digitization, is a key obstacle or a key element in today's environment. And then the power, obviously. There is a big tech which is impacting all aspects of our lives. Directly and indirectly. We cannot live without the internet, so we are continuously spreading data all around. We cannot avoid not spreading data. There is no choice. And then, of course, big tech impacting all layers through the disruptive technologies. And a clear example I would find is ChatGPT, where suddenly a whole sector, education sector, is at loss because they don't know how to handle this new environment where students can use this tool, and it changed the whole power structure or the whole education method, and suddenly people are not knowing what to do. The change hasn't finished. Like I said, we have generative AI, we're only seeing the beginning of it. We'll have immersive technologies, and for example, holograms are at odds with principles like data minimization and not use of biometric data. They need them to be able to be useful. So we're definitely at a totally different environment. What changed for individuals? Well, obviously I'm paraphrasing a bit, but we have become one living laboratory, as they call it in my days of certification, technical certification, we are one big test fest where the big tech companies are trying out their new things in life, because they don't know what will happen, but we'll find out while going. That's the approach. And in this living laboratory, obviously it's the technology, the tech industry, which is ruling. They rule our lives and our relations. And not only, and this sometimes leads to, I would call, the dummification of people, because under the umbrella of safety, for example, certain things can no longer, you cannot, for example, if you're in your car under the umbrella of safety, well, we started with the belt, but nowadays you have lane control, and I guess many of you have been ending up in a fight between what your car wants and what you want based on your experience as a driver. So, but we're not supposed to think for ourselves, it goes further and further. So it's a dummification that is imposed. And also societal textures are being broken. I already mentioned the education sector, ChatGPT, but also societal texture in the sense of how people live together. The whole hate on social media has a big impact on how we live together. So what happened with this informational asymmetry? Individuals are now faced with digital asymmetry. Transparency is no longer sufficient for informed consent. I'm not saying it's not important, it is important, but it's not sufficient. The individual is no longer in control, and the data protection baseline is thus broken. And we should not forget that the tech companies have not been elected, but they are defining society in a very strong way and how we live together. And even governments find themselves not always in the best position to counterbalance this. We must, as a society, decide the positive picture. So we must decide, where how we want to, the society we want to live in, how we want data to be used. The narratives today are very negative. So I welcome also the report which takes a positive approach. How can we do this? We have dystopian talks, and we talk and series like Black Mirror, etc., won't help in this effort. We must think, what society do we want to live in? And therefore we must ask questions, because we must establish a new, more extensive normative framework. The no secrets is no longer sufficient. We must ask, when does nudging become manipulation? And how does this impact mental integrity, which is a fundamental, is enshrined in the European Charter? And is mental integrity, is that a relative right or is it an absolute right? We must ask, should I be able to go beyond the algorithmic gate? Because, in fact, many things, recommendation systems, create a digital lock-in. And I was reading, I'd like to quote something I saw the other day where somebody said, okay, in your newspaper, rather than being on the internet, I still see that you are doing the l'art de l'inattendu, the art of the unexpected. And of course, if you're locked in, there is not an art of unexpected. Should a tech provider accept lifetime accountability for abuse, which, Facebook never started off with the idea to have all this hate speech. But while you are migrating and while you see how your service is being used, should you still have accountability? What will you do about it? Do I have to accept a care robot or a chatbot as an interface? How about my right to human contact? Should stickiness be allowed? Are spyglasses normal? Should I be raw material? And can you switch it off? Should innovation always be disruptive? How does it benefit society and people? This is the key question we must ask and which we must use to measure technology developments. And this is the public debate we must have. So concrete next steps is about taking back control. And we should definitely not listen to, for example, Eric Schmidt from Microsoft when he says, no, don't talk. We only experts should talk about this. Regulators, stay away. Public, stay away. But we mustn't listen to him. disregards all of us. Digital asymmetry requires a back to basics. How to ensure data use as a win for individuals and society. First and foremost, of course, an open door, enforcement of current rules. This is also something which is mentioned in the report. We must demand a human rights assessment, and not only for high-risk applications, and not only governments should have a public depository on what high-risk applications they're using. This should be for everybody. We should demand responsible AI, including, obviously, sustainability. And we should focus on standardization and interoperability, including also individual digital sovereignty. I've been working with Senelec on a document which should underlie standardization and which talks about individual digital sovereignty. What are our rights? Because this must impact and form standards. As I said before, a lot of things start with technology decisions being made, and then we are just running behind. Also, and the EU, for example, they're also on the AI Act, they're going to develop standards. But again, the human interest and the society must be a mandatory part of that. And we should ask ourselves, do we really need to digitize everything? It is very important to say that OpenAI in 2020, when they had version 3.5 ready from ChatGPT, they decided and publicly announced they didn't want to publish it because it was too dangerous. Sam Altman the other day, we're now in 4.5, still says it's too dangerous, but they have published. So what happened in between? What happened in between is that from a non-profit organization, a commercial factor came in, Microsoft, with a lot of investment, who now, I mean, that's my explanation of the story. You, of course, can disagree with me. But therefore, now it can be published, but it's still too dangerous. There's even a comparison that we should have something like an International Atomic Energy Agency to be able to deal with this. And still, we just dump it in society. We should introduce things like, when we talk about human rights, a right to identity, a right to agency, a right to mental privacy, right to protection from bias, right to meaningful human contact. These are all rights very important to maintain a good structure, both for individuals and for society. It will be key to ensure a pleasant environment to live in. Let me put it that simple. And I think probably I'm taking a lot of time. I would like to go to my final vision of data use and regulation formulated in a positive sense. We need to think, do we want an ashtray or do we want to ban smoking? That's a totally different thing if you want to combat potentially a disease. So a human-centric use of data is essential. We should do all of the things mentioned in your report, Rethinking Data. We should focus on infrastructure. We should focus on governance. We should focus on the institutions. And we should focus on democratic participation in decision-making. But we must embed this all in a new normative, human rights-centric regulatory framework that will impact and that will define the development of tech. If we do it this way, we will continue to live, we will have technology, will remain under human control. Technology and innovation will add societal value. Public authorities will take their responsibilities serious, and in my ideal world, individuals and collectives are empowered to take action. And individuals and society are back in control like we were under Web 1.0 in the old data protection days. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Adriana. I know it has been a huge challenge to go through such a complex issue in such a short amount of time, and I bet Adriana's presentation sparked a lot of questions and comments. So I want to change a little bit the dynamic in CPDP panel sessions and already invite you to share maybe 1-2 quick questions, and then we will move to our panel discussion, and after that we'll have another longer Q&A session. So if there are already questions or comments, I'm happy to take them now. We have one here in the front. Could we get some help with the mics? Yeah, I think that would be useful. Thank you. No worries.
Yeah, hello, my name is Sonia Jimenez and I worked at the International Data Space Association. And first I wanted to thank you, Adriana, for the really interesting presentation. And I wanted to ask you, you mentioned this individual digital sovereignty that's been brought to standardization, if I understood it correctly. Yes,
yes, this is like a project within Sensenelec, which was to put on a framework, a base document, which could potentially serve as input for further standardization. So it is not formal there, but that's the intention. And it's around digital sovereignty for states, companies, and individuals. And so my work concentrated on getting the individual in there.
Okay, thank you. Because I was thinking, because there's also an initiative from the European Commission, well, besides the data spaces, on specifically on personal data spaces, where I think this concept fits completely. So digital sovereignty for individuals. So I don't know if this has already been explored, because I think it would be a good link and very relevant input for this initiative.
I think this is a baseline document, so it's a bit, I think, probably has a broader scope. And then, for example, it urges that standardization must incorporate human rights. So you cannot standardize something without thinking about how human rights are influencing what you're standardizing, and that you must respect, and that the standard must respect that. So that's the high level idea of this document.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. And just to transition to our panel discussion, I want to see a show of hands. Who thinks that today we have enough regulatory mechanisms to address current challenges? Okay, okay, 7 people. 8, okay. So I assume the rest of the audience thinks we need more mechanisms or better ways to address issues of power, public participation, concentration of power, and many other things like that. And just to open up the round for our panelists, I'd like to invite them for their short reflections on what would be the most important opportunities they see following from the recently approved or in the works digital package, and what might be some of the key questions that are still left to be solved. And maybe we can start with Theresa.
So I think one big opportunity that I see, it's very close to something that Adriana referred to in her keynote, is to change from a paradigm where we currently have this model of release then evaluate to something where we evaluate and then release. Because as you mentioned, right, like what we are currently experiencing with the new generation of generative models is like all the issues that are caused when companies are free to release something like ChatGPT into the world, publicly accessible by everyone, without first having to attest to someone, to society, right, that the risks of these new technologies are controllable, or that at least the benefits that they bring outweigh like the risks or harms that might be caused. So I hope that like with a new round of regulations, we can move towards a model, like a kind of a slow release model, where we first need to find a way, okay, we need to find a new way of risk assessment, for instance, before we can have a new so-called disruptive technology, because I think we see for now it's kind of too disruptive. And the second big opportunity that I can see is to challenge a bit this assumption that in data-driven business, everything must be possible and should be done. That kind of, in the past, we've seen a lot that there was always this idea that whatever we want to do, whatever it might be, even though it might be privacy invasive, there will be some type of technological silver bullet solution that will just magically resolve all those trade-offs we have to make, for instance, between privacy and utility. And I hope that moving forward, we will avoid some of these mistakes and kind of from the outset think about, okay, what might be possible technologically, and then also like identify some areas where we say, okay, here we will never have like technological safeguards that, for instance, can achieve privacy by design in a way that we would like to. So we will have to rely on procedural controls, and then to make like very explicit, transparent decisions about, okay, such a system is maybe too risky and we don't want that. Or to say, okay, we accept it, we accept that the risk is very high because we rely on procedural controls, but to be like much more transparent about this thing, that certain things just cannot be done technologically, and acknowledge that also in the regulations and write them with that in mind.
Thank you very much. These are very important points. And if we look at the fast pace of how AI systems are being released, this is quite the opposite of what's happening currently. But Inge, can I invite you next to share your initial remarks?
Yeah, sure, and thank you for the invitation, for setting up this nice panel. So the main concern that I see in the digital sector is how we are becoming more and more dependent on digital technologies, digital platforms, indeed, as consumers, but I think also beyond that, it also applies to businesses, so small businesses who actually experience a lot of benefits from being able to reach a bigger group of consumers via e-commerce platforms. But it also, we see that these e-commerce platforms have a lot of power in steering where the innovation goes, how much rent these businesses in fact still have. And beyond that, of course, also as a society, you see that more and more digital platforms are taking up public tasks, like they become also active in sectors that used to be dominated by public bodies like healthcare, education. So this dependence has several layers, and I do think that the digital package that has now been adopted will help. It won't immediately change the dynamics, but I think it is a first step in us taking back control. And what I believe a particular opportunity is within that EU digital package is the data access and the transparency provisions, because this will also help increase our understanding of how these platforms function and how we have become so dependent on them. And if you look in particular at the DMA and the DSA, I think the provisions mainly build on concerns that we have already identified and on which we already agree that they are problematic. But I do think there are also risks beyond that, so things that we might not yet be aware of. And this is where data access and transparency could help to see concerns that we have not yet identified. And in particular, one promising mechanism, I think, is the researcher data access in the DSA, where the very large online platforms and the very large search engines are forced to give researchers access to data upon requests for research into systemic risks. So I think that carries great promise because on the one hand, this could help us identify the concerns that are not yet regulated in the digital package. And I think a second benefit is that to me, the main problem in the digital sector is enforcement. So going back to your question, maybe we indeed have sufficient laws, and laws are very flexible. They can be interpreted in a way that I think can cover many concerns, but enforcement is a key challenge and effective implementation. So, and by expanding the enforcement mechanism towards also including researchers, I think this could also create a clear benefit. But what, of course, will play a key role is how, in practice, this researcher data access will be implemented, because data access is one important value. But, of course, on the other hand, we also care about protecting privacy. Platforms might come up with valid IP concerns, security concerns. So how to find this trade-off, I think, will be very, very important. And this also requires upfront guidance to make sure that, these laws will actually have an effect in practice, are effectively implemented, and will also be effectively be enforced.
Thank you. And reflecting a little bit on Adriana's presentation, do you think these transparency mechanisms offer us the type of upgrade that Adriana was referencing to as a needed next step? Or do you think we should do some more tweaks?
Yeah, I think it definitely is a first step. So by transparency, you create more understanding of what is happening. Then you can also see how the existing laws can already be applied to address those concerns. And some things might have to be taken up by new enforcement actions or maybe by new laws. But I think it could be a start of, effectively taking back control, as Adriana was also saying.
Thank you. Kasia, if I can turn next to you for the same initial input on opportunities and questions that we still need to reflect on.
Thank you. No? Yes? No?
Yes. Yes?
Yes? No? I can't find... Okay, that one is on. It's very difficult to talk about framework of that size. We are talking about data protection, which is GDPR, platform accountability, which is the DMA package, AI Act. So I have to be superficial in my comments, and I apologize for this. But let me maybe move one step back to the lessons I think we learned before the reform of the EU data package, the new EU data package really started. What was the point of departure for the current reform? Certainly one lesson learned was the limitations of individual agency, right? That we can't expect so much as probably GDPR and similar frameworks expected from individuals acting in their own defense. It's one thing to say, oh, individuals love to manage their data when they have something to gain, like they can make money on it or they can gain very attractive service. It's another thing to expect them to take their data in their own hands when they are simply treated as raw resource and deprived of any agency. So expecting that individuals go against the current structural, power imbalance, it was a fallacy. It was something we had to acknowledge it won't happen. And therefore, the power of default has been appreciated finally in this new thinking we have now in the EU, and the power or the role of the enforcers. So enforcers acting at their own initiative, not waiting for individuals to flood them with complaints, not even waiting for people like us, watchdog organizations, researchers, to bring problems, because it's the enforcers that should have much more power, like the Commission now building their new internal capacity to do the auditing, to do the research that needs to be done, to check what's going on, without waiting for us to do this job for them without adequate budgets and access to data. So that was the first important lesson I see somehow reflected in this new package. The second one is the limitation of how much we can transform the power with transparency and privacy settings. I think for a very long time in my bubble, transparency has been such a goal almost on its own. And then at some point we realized that it's not going to get as far, because even if we somehow manage to open these black boxes, even if magically we force companies like Meta, Google to show us real profiles, real behavior profiles, which is nearly impossible for technical reasons as well. What that means for individual, again, who can handle that complexity, who can handle all these long transparency reports. It is a game for experts and even for us quite irritating, and whoever played privacy settings game knows that at the end, it's like in the casino, we always lose. So we have to go beyond that thinking and propose solutions that are not based on user choice at all, that are maybe a bit more top-down, maybe things like prohibiting certain operations with data. I've been advocating for a long time in the DSA context prohibition of dealing with inferred data, so data that are observed about us that we never provided for certain purposes, like advertising. It should not be part of the game. If it's not there, we don't need to worry so much as individuals to control it because we can feel safe. So creating a safe default, again, rather than relying on anybody going to these transparency dashboards, privacy settings, and dealing with this, especially when they are really fake settings. Then the whole idea of individual agency was also problematic, wasn't it? Because the real stakes are for the society here, not for individuals. Every research I know comes to this conclusion at some point, that at individual level, you can see a harm, but there's almost never a dead body. Okay, almost never. But hopefully we won't have many of these dead bodies, right? This is not what we want to have in order to prove our argument. We don't want serious individual harm as necessary element for the debate to change something. We need to talk about societal stakes that are only visible at scale, that are only visible when you look at how the public debate travels, which directions, who is the influencer, who has the super influence, which voices are marginalized, which types of content are promoted and why, how people's data is used to create trends, to manage their behavior. This is all visible at scale. So we need to regulate the societal aspects of the technology even more than we regulate this individual harm or individual experience. And then finally, important lesson that already was mentioned here is that data is not always a problem. It can also be value if treated properly and if regained for for societal goals again. So it's not the case we just want to get rid of data, right? It's not always we want to prohibit any inferences and any observation, because in some contexts, observing humans, learning from what they do can actually be beneficial for the humans. And with all these lessons, we came to the package that in many elements that I can't describe now because I would need 1 hour at least just to do that, but in many elements, DSA, DMA, the new AI Act, they follow these lessons. They try to deal with data differently, not just to protect individual agency and not just to prevent data collection, obviously, but it's not yet, we are not yet there. We are definitely far from regaining that agency for the society and regaining value over data for our own goals. We are very far from safe defaults even, and I can speak to this later, and we are far from creating choice architecture that would be independent from the dominant companies. So there are many gaps, but already these lessons I briefly described are somehow acknowledged at least, and that's a big shift.
Thanks, Kasia. I would like to open up the floor now for questions and comments from you. I have 8 pages of questions, but I'm pretty sure you have very interesting things to ask as well. Any takers? If not, I'm going to go back to my 8 pages.
Here, right? Yeah, I see the button and I'm pushing. Now.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Cool. Okay, thank you. Christian Reimsbach from the OECD. I guess I have two questions, or maybe probably more like on the comment side of things. First of all, regarding the question whether we need regulation, more regulation, and I would probably be more on the argument on the side that it's not about the quantity of the regulation. I mean, if at all, it's about the quality. But I would even go further and say, even if you had the best regulations, and to connect to what Adriana said, but you had the dumbest population, it wouldn't be also helpful. So there is probably much more than just regulation that is needed. Empowerment, definitely, education, and so on. So and in that sense, policies and regulation can be helpful. But I think that there is probably a much more fundamental issue that I see here, which is related to disruptive innovation. How do we deal with that? And how should we treat this? And I guess it relates somehow, I was wondering as I saw also the list of questions that you had, Adriana, on your slides about the different rights that we had. And I couldn't but think about the question, do we have a right to be shielded from disruptive innovation? And I think it's a tricky one, because on one hand, yes, we say we want to be protected. Innovation should be slow enough. But on the other hand, we should also acknowledge that change is necessary, because the status quo is not always the best world. So I wondered if you see a situation or way how we can kind of have a balanced approach to, yes, we want to have innovation, we want to have change, because we want to put society on a path towards improvement, but nevertheless, we want to address the risk that comes with innovation without necessarily using rules or regulation as a way to prevent innovation.
Yeah, thank you very much for that question comment. We have a reaction from Theresa, but I wanted to highlight one thing before. When I say regulation, I don't necessarily mean new laws. Regulation can take many different forms. It can be standards. It can be voluntary mechanisms, although, well, iffy if they work or not. Market interventions. We can have all sorts of types of regulation. So yeah, just to keep that in mind throughout this discussion. But Theresa has an immediate reaction to that.
Yeah, what I found really interesting is to hear the wording, do we have a right to be shielded from technology? Because for me, this really shows like kind of part of the problem, right? Which is that we now live in a time where we talk about being shielded from the technology. We don't say anymore being shielded from the harms that might be caused by the technology, but really ask ourselves the questions, oh, do I have a right to kind of like be entirely like not touched by something? So I think this already shows that there is definitely like a need for action and a need for change in the way that we currently do release technologies. And then about this question that I heard in there, maybe I'm interpreting that wrong, is about like how do we deal with these like disruptive technologies? I think it's nobody here probably wants to say, okay, let's stop innovation, let's stop like disruption. I think like far from that. I think it's actually more about finding new ways of innovating, and I think it's exactly about this like slow release model. Like I think we just need more time to prepare for the release of a new technology, and I think there are absolutely ways where in the background, while I don't know, the engineers are working on the implementation of something, the researchers are working on like the new training algorithm for the AI model. I think with that we just need like a third path, right? That from the start accompanies this process that looks at how can I assess this new technology, because what we have right now, and I think causes a lot of these problems, is the technology is there, and now, I mean, we still struggle, right, to like, I don't know, assess the risk of very simple data sharing. Like, we still struggle to like find good ways of assessing the risk of like the machine learning methods that we have like for more than a decade now. So I just think if we're given a bit more time to already start developing the risk assessment and evaluation methods along the new technologies, it would already resolve like a lot of this tension that is caused.
Yeah, I just wanted to echo in a sense what you're saying too. Technology used to be fun. You know, we were all excited when, you know, the computer came, but it's no longer fun. So that means something is wrong. That means we're served up things we're not ready for yet, or which come too fast, or which are too disruptive. So definitely, you know, we need to remain curious and look at new ways and research and bring new things, you know. We definitely need to continue. Humans are curious. We should continue to be curious. But it is in the public interest of individuals in society to not own, to take time and to look at, you know, how does it fit with human rights, for example? What does that, what feedback does human rights assessment give us on the technology we want to introduce? And also, how can we introduce it responsibly? Responsible AI is a very important factor. And even today, there are tools available, like, for example, you can certify your AI if you want to, where one looks at, you know, privacy aspects, governance, bias. And these are not like tick boxes like you have in other types of certification, but they require discussions in companies, you know, from C-level to whatever level. And then also, how can a company just drop something on us which puts a whole sector into problems? Just imagine it was your neighbor just dumping, you know, his whatever on in your garden. Would you accept that? No, you want him to talk to you and say, listen, you know, I have this issue, I want to change this. How shall we do this? There is discussion and not just, you know, directive behavior. Thank you.
Thank you. Inge, I want to bring you in as well on reflecting a little bit on whether there are new sources of power that we see today when it comes to the large players. Is this similar to what we've experienced maybe a decade and a bit ago with social media when it comes to, you know, new AI releases, or is there something new that we should be concerned or we should be looking at?
Yeah, I mean, when you think of digital platforms, there is, of course, a whole discussion of whether it would help to see them as utilities, since they become sort of like the infrastructure on which we rely to get many services and many other benefits. So I do think there is some novel elements in the power that they bring, and this particularly relates to the fact that it's not only like a single power, like a single control over a particular activity or over a particular market. What I see as maybe a novel element is the fact that we have these ecosystems of services which become bigger and bigger and bigger, which are become closely related to each other, and where also the benefits that they can attract from one market, in particular the data then in this context, to also become stronger in different activities. And this cross-cutting power, I think, is very difficult to match with a regulatory framework that inherently focuses on particular concerns. So that is also what we see with the EU digital package. We have the DMA that focuses more on the competition concerns, fairness, contestability of markets. The DSA that also looks at content moderation, systemic risks. The Data Act, the Data Governance Act that also tried to promote space for smaller businesses, for data intermediaries, for instance. So it is a very comprehensive framework that each by their own focuses on different aspects, but that also could mean that it's becoming quite fragmented in the way we look at these concerns and also in the way these frameworks are enforced. And what I see is also that this fragmentation sometimes is used by platforms to their benefit. So for instance, what we see in the competition field is that some platforms might rely on privacy as a reason not to open up their systems. So where they say, well, we would be happy to share data, for instance, but we don't want to harm the privacy of our users. And these kind of trades-off trade-offs between different legal domains, different public interests. This really stems from the way law is built. You can inherently only do a couple of things with one law. It has its own legal definitions, own enforcement systems, whereas the power of some of these companies really is like a more overarching concern. So I think in that sense, the power that we see is becoming much stronger and has different forms than the power that we maybe used to address with these different legal domains that have their own concepts and are also enforced by different regulators. So I think the trade-offs that come with that, and also the cooperation, I think that is needed between regulators. This is something that, where we still need to do a lot more work.
Oh yeah, definitely. Cooperation amongst regulators is a really big one, and we'll have to see how that plays out in practice with the new mechanisms. Are there any questions, comments from the audience? Yeah, thank you.
It's on. Pierre de Witt, researcher at the École Center for IP and IT Law in Belgium. I have a question which might be more of a societal question, but I've always wondered whether users might be just inherently lazy. And it comes from my own experience that I've been trying to push for open source alternatives in my own surroundings at work, and I see absolutely no interest in these solutions, despite them being on the market for years and working as well. So I was wondering whether we might have reached the limit of informed consent, because I feel like whatever, let's say, options users are faced with, they will inevitably choose convenience and user-friendliness over their own privacy. So it feels like a bit trying to save pandas falling from the same trees every time. And very depressing, I have to say, in my own experience. So maybe, Adriana, you might reflect on that because of your years of experience. Katarzyna also mentioned these issues as well. So it would be very interesting to hear your thoughts.
I'm happy to comment because I mentioned this in my intro remarks. I do think people should have the right to be lazy, passive, and don't care, because it's not their obligation to be active. And that's what I meant by limitations of individual agency, but also the fallacy of choices we are now offered online. I'm not surprised people don't care anymore after trying 1,000 times to set a different setting or opt out of something that happens to come back through the back door. I mean, how long can you play this game? And we have people trained in this experience all their lives. Most of us probably remember internet without pop-ups everywhere, but younger people, they don't. So yes, I do not think we can build this change we are discussing here on individual agency that is self-defense. That's what I meant. I hope that when we offer people real choices, attractive choices, choice to modify their experience, choice to have different feed, choice to have different infrastructure, then they get interested. But if we are talking about self-defense against abuse that is invisible and they do not experience it until there is one form of a dead body or harm, how can we expect this from humans who are busy having their lives? So yeah, so for me this is a very normal situation, nothing to be depressed about. The interesting question is what other institutions can we build to help these passive individuals? I don't know, is this the moment where we started, or? Yeah, because one of the questions we were asked by Valentina before coming here was, what are the novel or new institutions we should be considering? So again, back to the framework we have. I'm happy to build on the example that one of the ladies already gave, risk assessments. I do think if there is one interesting opening, in the new framework, it is a risk assessment for very large online platforms, because it includes societal risks, individual risks, and it's not closed, it is not locked to specific solutions. So we don't have a list of solutions in the law that the Commission can only do these three things. It's pretty open. So in the perfect world, this year in autumn, very large platforms deliver risk assessments. The Commission looks at them and says, oh, you haven't mitigated your risks. There is much more risk in your interfaces, in your algorithms than you acknowledge. So now let's play this game. We give you a solution, you implement it, the platform, and we see how that works. Yes, so theoretically, we can expect exactly this kind of dialogue and pretty forceful solutions from the Commission. I don't know whether it happens. It has a chance to happen. In our bubble, European Digital Rights Network and beyond, we are working hard these days to influence this process. We see in autumn. But what could happen, for example? For example, I can imagine that building on very modest but existing interoperability provisions and building on our knowledge of the structural power imbalances, the Commission says every large platform should go one step beyond what DSA mandates and not only give people choice, opt out from being profiled, behaviorally profiled on the platform to receive a news feed, but every platform should actually give people real choice to modify their feed not based on personal data. That would be, in my opinion, a very interesting innovation, because then we would see whether people care at all to modify their experience. So first we depart from the problem, which is behavior observation as the basis of profiling, which always gets us in the corner where our vulnerabilities are exposed and exploited and our engagement, is the real objective. So we are forgetting this. We are imagining this problem disappeared. And then the real question becomes, do people want a real personalization not based on their data as the option? We can offer this to them. Technologically, it's not complicated, right? It's like Netflix for Facebook or something like that. We can imagine, we can even prototype this settings and then see what happens. And maybe then we see that people are no longer so passive because they can choose the persona for today. They can choose whether they go to Facebook or something similar for work, for entertainment, for relax, for news, what kind of news they want to see, whether they are fed up with their rabbit hole, they want to see how a different rabbit hole looks like. Maybe then they become playful and open and interested because they get options, right? Not option to check your very long list of data that is not really your data, it's just some kind of fiction Facebook is serving you, talking about demographies and localizations when they do much deeper profiling. You forget this bullshit settings and you get real settings that get you interested. So it's just one example of a new institution or mechanism that we can build if only we have the enforcer that treats their new law, their new obligations under the new law seriously, when we have somebody on the market proposing real innovation and some compliance from the big players. But there are many ideas like this that we could test and see how they fly.
Very briefly, I think informed consent is a concept which will be applicable for certain cases. It is no longer the full answer to our problems as it was in the past. As I said, there's a digital asymmetry and no longer an informational asymmetry. So it is a tool relevant in certain cases, but not in all cases. I think people are definitely would like to have more options. I think, but it's too tedious. So I'm hopeful, especially if I see, for example, the discussions in various markets around COVID applications. People were very interested in what happened, and people were participating in the public debate. So I don't think people are not interested. They are interested, but you can't change anything while you're, on the internet. You have to take it or not participate. That's in the end, the 0-1 question you are faced with. And I think I leave it at there. So I think there is hope, but you should make it easy for people and not complicate it with all too many, with options, which are not really options. People are not stupid neither.
Thank you. Any other questions? Because if not, I have two burning ones before we close up the panel. And one is going back to the question of inferences that Kasia mentioned a bit earlier. But this is more from, let's say, both a technical and a societal perspective that I'd like Theresa to come in. Because we know currently there are sets of profiles that are applied to you without you offering directly your data. So you are part of a majority, of a sort of a bucket that fits some decisions or some descriptions about you. And what happens if you're outside of those majority profiles? What happens when you're in a vulnerable position or when you're part of a minority? And I think I'd like Theresa to expand a little bit more on these types of implications and how they translate to large-scale processing, especially with AI systems.
Yeah, I think it's a very good example of a kind of a new category of risk that we don't really think enough about yet, because I think we're still busy with processing concerns around like fairness and privacy and so on. And I like to refer to it as this like risk of false conclusions, right? Because we're currently a bit like led to believe that this new generation of AI technologies that we have, like the new generative language and image models, that they produce ever more accurate inferences, and that the predictions that they produce about the future are much more accurate. But I think it's a dangerous narrative because it makes us forget that this is still like exactly the same types of model, right? It's like still based on statistics, and there's always a statistical error. And what's happening currently is that a lot of this error is like shifted more and more towards the edges, kind of towards what we call the outliers or the outsiders or like minority groups. Where also in like generative models, there is like a big risk that these models forget about like certain groups, and if you're not represented well enough in the training data, it's kind of bad luck for you. So to give like a very concrete example, like you can imagine like let's say a national public health service wants to move towards a data-driven model for allocating research funds, and as mostly happens, right? Let's say this public health service decides to go to a startup to ask them to generate some synthetic data for privacy concerns to run their analysis on, because they say, okay, like raw data about patients and health, like it's very, we're being told, okay, if we work with synthetic data, the privacy side, will be much easier to like deal with. It's a different question whether that's true. But let's say this startup then proposes their new fancy AI-based generative model for generating some synthetic data. This now becomes entirely like a black box about what statistical patterns, right, are preserved in the synthetic data that the public National Health Service wants to run their analysis on for allocating research fund. And it can now very easily happen, right, that this black box does not reproduce some data about a rare illness, and in the end we allocate like 0 funds to researching this illness, even though there might have been like a very easy win, like well, with a bit of like research we could have saved like a lot of lives, right? But we've forgotten about these people because we decided to rely on this like AI black box like in the middle. So there's really risk if we over rely on some predictive or inferential technologies, that like there are these kind of like risks creeping in through the back doors that before we didn't have, right? If we had done some very simple summary statistics of the data and run our analysis on it, it would have been at least very clear, where is the error, where should we look at, and I think that's maybe like these new categories of risk that are created by new types of technologies. We maybe don't think enough about them yet, and there may be like, there could be a lot of harm caused by that, which is not really captured yet by regulations.
Thank you, Theresa. One more question? Okay, you have to be very, very fast because I have to wrap up in 3 minutes. Thank you.
I promise I will be very fast. But there's still 2 points. The very first one is basically just I think we have to acknowledge that profiling is rarely actually not always the end game, but very often actually what is being cared about is automation, and profiling is essentially a way to the automation, as we just heard by the example. And I think there are some implications with that. But maybe my actual question was about the answer that was given to my very first question, where the panelist, I think it was Theresa, who actually said, we are not ready yet to basically embrace disruptive technologies such as ChatGPT kind of AI models. And my question that came to me, and this is something I would like to hear from you, when you say we, I guess the question is, who do we mean by we? Because I guess some people may see themselves as being more ready than others, but more importantly, what does it mean to be ready? If you could give us an answer to that, because I think that's really important for, at what point in time do we say we are ready?
Very good question. Let me think back what the we was that I was thinking of. I think for me it was the we that I was talking about is that I'm kind of part of a group of people, like in the more kind of academic sphere, mostly, where people often come to us and say, hey, you're like an engineer, give me a technology that does X. And very often that X is kind of risk assessment, privacy evaluations, or something like that. So just to clarify maybe what I had in mind here. And I think it's just very frustrating for us because we would like to help, right? We really work day and night to help, but that job becomes super hard if you're not involved from the very start of the design of the digital infrastructure, but you're kind of always asked to add something ad hoc afterwards, because that's mostly an impossibility. Like, I don't know, for instance, if somebody has designed a system that is general purpose, like general purpose AI, it becomes impossible to afterwards put back in purpose limitation, which is like a very, very helpful guiding principle if you can use it like from the start. So I think this is what I meant more in terms of like being ready for like a technology. I think this still imagines this like sequential thing of like the design and engineering like happens and then it's released. And then afterwards we do like risk assessment and we come up with new regulation that like refers to the starting point. So for me, this like being ready was more like, let's entirely change the idea of, you know, doing everything kind of at the same time so that we're always ready. Because I think if we change the model and the paradigm here a bit, we should be always ready.
I can only add to this that I do not think there can be any rule set in the stone that will protect us from all the risks coming with new types of AI and other tech. So we won't see this written in the law in a way of prohibiting something or making obligations around something. I agree, is a cycle of decision making that we can improve, and procedures like accessing data, accessing models, making models available for the society. So is the process we need to get right and not the substance of the law in the sense like saying, oh, AI can only serve for XYZ and it should not do the other things. No, for me, this is a very short-term thinking, but what we have in the AI Act, which I don't like, and I'm wasting a lot of time trying to improve it without much hopes, but still one thing good there is that it includes this process, it defines this process, and in your example from healthcare, we would have all these elements you mentioned you would like to have all these elements are covered by AI Act. So even if we fail to improve it more, it's already there. For systems that are perceived high risk, we should have the knowledge about, how it was trained, explainability, human supervision, and all that. So at least on the basic level, this process that makes us more ready, more prepared is there. But it's not enough. In the report that Ada co-created with a group, we have 4 areas of intervention, and all of them go much further than what we discussed now. So I can only encourage the audience to go back there because our time is over, right?
Yeah, thank you, Kasia. That would have been my closing plug to you all, but Kasia already did that, so thank you very much. It was a really lovely and rich discussion. I barely went through half a page of my questions, so I invite you to find out more about our work at the Lovelace Institute. We have many reports that cover different areas of the discussion today, and please sign up to our newsletter. And thank you very much for being here tonight. Thank you.